3H project, yes, I'll see it.
Yeah.
Okay, right, okay. Well, look, what I'm going to do tonight, if you don't mind, because I'm covering vast amounts of territory tonight, is I'm going to just keep this small screen down the left-hand side open. So as it sort of keeps me in check, because I started to lose a run of myself last week, and I don't want to do it again this week. So first of all, it's being recorded, I hope. Your screen sharing video should be recording. Or hang on. Anybody know how to do this? No? Stop video. It should be recording.
It says recording at the top.
Can you see that, Carl? Yes.
Yeah,
Right, that's fine.
Recording.
That's fine. The recordings will be ready for you in about another 2 weeks, because there's an awful lot to cover, and I know we're covering a lot of space, and you want to go back on this, especially if you are coming on a tour and you want to actually point things out. So I need to also have to design the website. That's another thing I have to do, but I'll be working at that in the next couple of weeks. So kick off. Come on, work. There we go. Okay. So we're now down to number 3, which is preaching to the history heathens, religion and riots in the 19th century. What I'm going to try and demonstrate tonight is 2 things. First of all, the origins of the split in religion here between Catholics and Protestants, rather than the united or fairly united Belfast that was the late 1700s, whenever the Belfast Volunteers were marching to St Mary's Church, which was the parish church of Brown Square for Catholics. And there was a spirit of reconciliation, for want of a better word. And then the 1798 rebellion happened. So we're gonna pick up from there. And so we know what happened to Henry Joy. As I said last week, he was in the Brown Square Masonic Lodge. I don't think this bit here, this is John Kerry at his work here. You know, the guy who painted this, and he painted it 100 years later. But I think it's significant that even 100 years later, he has these guys here realizing that, yeah, the rebellion might be over, but it's never over till it's over, as I say. And you can see the yeomen. Okay, so these are the Belfast yeomen, and they're actually pointing the cannon at the crowd, just to be sure. So what happened? What happened at Brown Square? Well, James Hope came back to live in Brown Square, and it's where he died. He was buried from his son's house. He lived in Frederick Street, but he died here. He was very poor. He died a man of no property. And he had to be very careful in what he did. Because once the rebellion was over, you had a choice to make. You could either still be a rebel, in which case you could still be hung, or be a 50 guinea man, so a £5,000 reward on your head for being captured, or you can keep your head down, or you can go another way. For James Hope, he came to live in Brown Square. He lived roughly where number 1 Brown Square is today. It's a small, not a cottage, it's a bungalow. And he quietly dictated his memoirs of the 98 rebellion to Dr. Madden. And if you're reading about the 98 rebellion, you're more than likely reading James Hope's memories of that. And he did it in secret. He did it either here at Brown Square, which I would have my doubts, but I suspect he did it at Israel Milliken's house, which is on Peters Hill, or he went down, even though he's a very old man in his 80s, he went down to Marianne McCracken's house, where we know for definite he dictated his memoirs. So for those rebels, Protestants, Catholics, they had to make choices in what they were going to do. But it wasn't that way for all United Irishmen. It was that way for those that were of a lower class. For the upper class, well, here you have William Tennant, and he was a United Irishman. He was one of the leaders. If, you know, to be honest, he should have been, like everyone else, as a leader, executed, but no, he wasn't. He was fortunate not to have shared Henry Joy McCracken's fate at the end of a rope, but he spent more than 3 years in a Scottish prison, so that would have been Fort George. Returned to Belfast in 1801, Tenants soon afterwards became the town's richest merchant and banker. So making no attempt to deny his revolutionary past or the fact that he had fathered no more than 13 illegitimate children. That's something a bit like Boris Johnson, I think, all of whom he provided for. Tennant publicly led a 30-year campaign to seek root and branch reform in the town. It's a painting of the man. If you go into First Rosemary Street Church Presbyterian, you'll see a massive monument to him. So not all rebels were treated equally. When it came to Catholics who took part in the rebellion or who had to prove that they were more loyal to survive, well, as you can see here, the worst offenders in Belfast during the rebellion, who literally destroyed the presses of the Northern Star, was these guys here, the Monaghan Militia. So I think it's number 2. Yes, so this would be the uniform of the Monaghan Militia. And as I said last week, this is where the original Belfast volunteers who could make their own political minds up, who were under orders really from their own captains. By the time the Monaghan Militia came along, they were under British Army, what became British Army control. And so you'll see the anthem, Sergeant Major, and speaking as an ex-soldier myself, this is actually a pretty good representation of a Sergeant Major's face, and a Grenadier in the Londonderry Militia. And so what happened to those volunteers, so for those Belfast volunteers who became United Irishmen, they were either exiled, they were sent abroad, they left, they joined. So that you 2 ways to prove your loyalty. For defenders, for the Catholic defenders, they too joined the British military, the yeomen. Most got out of town, but they weren't as compromised by informers as the Presbyterians and the Protestants. And so this next painting then is, if you think back to the 1798 rebellion, this painting was about 1801, and although it's titled The Belfast Yeomen, it's actually pictured at College Green in Dublin, but you can tell that it's painted after the Act of Union, because if you look at the Union flags here, okay, the cross of St. Patrick is now added to the flag, which is why they're parading these flags. And it is very much a British military parade. And most of these guys would have been marched off to take part in the Battle of Waterloo, which took place 14 years later. So what happened then? Well, some also joined a group called the Orange Order, because you had to prove your loyalty. No better way than proving your loyalty if you were an Irish rebel, especially if you lived in places like Ballyclare, Doak, Brushane, that was at the heart of the rebellion. The simplest way to do it was to join either the British militia, which meant you would have been marched away, or join the Orange Order, which had emerged in 1785, and it was just beginning to really flex its legs. It was a very flat organization where it was very much working class to begin with, but it was quickly began to be run by the upper echelons of society. And there's no greater proof of that. So the Grand Master of Orange Lodge in 1828 was Frederick Augustus, the Duke of York, and he was the second son of George III. So these people they seen the potential of the Orange Order. They seen it as a way where they could engage with those lower strata of society. And some would argue, including me, that it was a way also to control those strata. And you had the last real big connection that I know of, still looking into this, was the guy who actually dissolved the Orange Order, because they realized this guy here, Ernest Augustus, the King of Hanover, and he was the 5th son of George IV. So he became the Grand Master, but they then began to realize that the Orange Order itself and the yeomen who was contained within the British Army sometimes didn't respond to orders. And so a committee was set up to look into the yeomanry and the penetration of the Orange Order and Orange men within the yeomanry. So the evidence given to the committee, which looked at this from Parliament, which filled about 3 blue books, established beyond doubt that what had been general knowledge in Ireland since 1785, that is, that Orange men controlled the Irish yeomanry, had lodges in the army, enjoyed a certain immunity from justice in Ulster, and were frequently engaged in civil disturbances. It's clear that some prominent Belfast citizens, including Thomas Ferner, who was the last sovereign of Belfast, by the way, before it became a Lord Mayor, and a relative of first Orange Grand Master, they belonged to the Orange Order. But by the 1830s, and we're about to move into that now, the amount of rioting that took place, they were afraid that the army was being overcome. And so this guy here, Ernest Augustus King of Hanover, dissolved the Orange Order in 1835 and banned parades of any type until 1845. So going back to Brown Square, so here you have an orange banner. You perhaps begin to see some significance of it here, and you'll see this shop just on the left here coming into prominence. And I do want to remind you that this is Hayes Tavern, or it's either that building or that building, but my money is on that. Sorry, that building there was the location of Hayes Tavern. And so the most disloyal citizens in the kingdom became the most loyal kingdoms in the citizen. And so this is the Brown Square Orange Lodge. And it was in existence right up until 2009, which ties in very much with the destruction of Brown Square, the Belfast Urban Plan, which we'll find out about. But you can see that the Orange Order by the end, you can see the sashes actually are a sash, because that's the difference. The sash goes over your shoulder and down around your waist, whereas what is now known as a sash, or people identify, is actually a collarette, which just goes around the collar, easier to maintain. So I'm not sure who these guys, I got this from Colleen O'Reilly, who's the archivist at the Orange Museum at the Craigie Road. But I love this picture because of this guy here. I would love to know the story of this guy, because there's your first bowler hat. I would assume that he was a shipyard man, and he would have been at managerial level or senior foreman in the shipyard for to have that bowler hat. So if you have that at Brown Square, so what happened then to people who then, of the Catholic religion, who would never have subscribed to the Orange Order? So here you have Carrickhill, and you also have here, so the Irish National Foresters Club. So they're based down here in Albert Street. Okay. It's a fantastic club. As you can see, before COVID, it was open every Tuesday. Have open mic nights, storytelling. It's on TripAdvisor. But they sprang out of this group here, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which, believe it or not, was started in America and actually came back to Ireland. But there's a bit more about that next week. So how do you have the most loyal people in Ireland becoming the most disloyal, then becoming the most loyal again? So it's simply need. They had to. But in today's historiography, and this is why I wanted to include this in the course, there is a current, over the years, people have went out of their way just to accept what they believe to be history as history. And yet it is completely not what you think it is. And this is best illustrated by this. So this is Louis XVI as he was going to the scaffold. And really, this was whenever people in the Enlightenment and Protestants believed that Catholics were not in the thrall of the Pope, and they could be rational and make up their own minds. But what you have here in the background is an Irish priest, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but you can just see the crucifix, and he's trying to bless Louis before he goes up the scaffold. Because lo and behold, after the Irish Rebellion, the most loyal people in Ireland were Catholics. So the history of the life of the most noted Dr. Francis Moylan, 1735 to 1815, the Royal Borough of Cork. So former Roman Catholic bishop, educator, reformer, friend of the poor, builder of the North Chapel, seat of worship of all righteous papists, loyal and faithful servant who defended this realm against all enemies of our most gracious majesties, George III and George IV, in the years of rebellion 1796 and 1798. And so there you have how history was rewritten, because by 1898, the Catholic Church itself had begun to realize that they needed to revise this history, that the majority of their flock were not loyalists, in fact, quite the opposite. And so they had to come up, find a way to do that. And in fairness to this particular guy here, and to Catholics at the time, I am not trying to judge here, because they were suffering from the penal laws. And again, how do you prove loyalty? Well, you swear loyalty and you join things. You attack those people who are disloyal. And as a reward, Maynooth University, who was the first Catholic university, before that, Catholics would have had to leave to go to France, Germany, and Spain to be educated. And this was funded by the British government. So you can make your own minds up about that. So how does historiography work? Well, it's worked down through the times. And I really do recommend that you read this guy's book. This is guy's book, sorry, Freudian slip. This is Guy Berner. And it certainly would influence me and has led me to then start to work out what is memory, what is history, how does it work. So he's at the grave of William Orr, who was a Protestant. And whenever Henry Joy McCracken died, one of the rings he had on had the inscription, "Remember Orr." At the Battle of Antrim, the men who charged shouted, "Remember Orr," as they did at Balnahinch. So he was hung, William Orr, at Carrickfergus on the Three Sisters, which to this day I can't find. So I've been trying for 20 years now to get the exact location. Hasn't worked. But by 1898, the Catholic Church had totally revised itself. And so some of the heroines and heroes of the 98 rebellion, then, their memories were then revoked. And this one here is Betsy Gray from County Down. So I can show you how this memorialization actually works in commemoration and revisionism. So what you had was a memorial to Betsy Gray, and we know this existed in 1896, and nobody made a fuss about it. And this is the point that Guy Berner made. It was a nice memorial. We're not actually 100% certain that's the exact spot, but it was as close as they could get. But there was a massive campaign to commemorate 98, led by the Catholic Church. And so by then the railways had opened up. And so there was excursions in Belfast to visit Betsy Gray's grave. There was flowers laid. So lo and behold, it should say 8. So there you go. By 1976, this grave had been totally destroyed. Now, the problem here is Betsy Gray was a Protestant, but she was deemed to be a rebel, which at the time was a great thing if you're a Protestant at Balnahinch. But by 1976, the memorial had been totally destroyed. As you can see here, 1898, Orange Riotism at Balnahinch, contemporary depiction of the desecration of a monument. So this had got as far as the English press. And as you can see, they didn't get the memorial right, okay, but they got the gist of it. And you can see the representation, and you can see the representation of an orange man, and you can see the features of his face. And I want you to sort of bear in mind that as we go through the presentation. So how does that work for Brown Square? So the Orange Order survived, but there is still issues, because back even as far back. So this is the bottom right is my son. This is my son, my grandson Finn, who's now 3, myself at the last St. Patrick's Day parade, which unfortunately is not going to take place this year. And so my son and Finn live at Dromara. My son would rather die than join the Orange Order, mainly because he grew up in a household where he could question things and that was never forced on him. But that wasn't the case in my part, because on this top right picture here, you have the last Orange Order march to the field before the Second World War. So this is July 1939, just before the war broke out. And just down here, you have my grandfather. That's William Andrew Higgins. Bottom left is you have what became known as the UVF Lodge, because in that lodge was senior members of the UVF, the Red Hand Commandos, the Shankill Butchers. And you have there at the very back, that's my father. And my father came and was born in Ballyclare. And he came, his father was a Grand Master of his Orange Lodge. And I've traced it back 3 generations, and then it stops. So it stopped. And it's my belief when I get locked down over that I'm going to trace my family back that side of it, the Ballyclare side of it, in the hope that somewhere back there there's a rebel, because that's certainly my DNA. But how did I know that? Because that's me. So that's me in the white shirt, because I was supposed to follow in my father's footsteps. But as you're probably guessing by the picture on the right, that sort of way didn't work out too well. And my father will come into this because he lived down here at Brown Square later on. In this particular photograph here, I brought this up. I want you to see it. So what you have is Brown Street's going to feature in our presentation a lot more of these slides tonight. And so the irony of irony is you have the RUC, which is the Belfast Police Force, before it became a PSNI, and they're at Brown Street. So in the background, the new College of Technology had been knocked down and the Belfast Met was about to be built. And this is Carrick Hill Memorial Bond, and I think it's James Hope. And so you have the name of James Hope being used from a Republican background, and just up the street there would have been 200, 300 loyalists with bricks, bottles, stones, or as we said last week, brickbats. So do people really not know their history? Do they just literally take what they think is the truth and just deliver it? So I picked this up 2 days ago. So the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has apologised and reacted to a claim that Sinn Féin has no Protestants as senior politicians. And of course, Violet Wynne, who's a TD, then immediately responded, I'm a Protestant, I'm proud to be a representative for Sinn Féin. Changing facts is not the people voted for. So of course, I was not aware of that. I stand corrected. This is the Taoiseach. This is the Vice Prime Minister of the Irish Republic, who automatically assumed that if the Protestants could not lead within Sinn Féin. And on the other hand, you have here, so Douglas Hyde, the first president of the Irish before it became the Irish Republic, after it was reformed from the Free State. And he actually, last year marked the 125th anniversary of the formation of the Gaelic League. And you can see him riding in state with the Irish Army as it became. And of course, Douglas Hyde was a Protestant. So we make these assumptions. And how did that happen at Brown Square? This, for example, is an illustration of an Orange Parade in Canada. And it very much would have been an Orange Parade in Australia or New Zealand or New York. Here you have the Ancient Order of Hibernians parading in New York City. And I'm hoping you're beginning to see the similarities here, okay? And you have ribbon men. So ribbon men would have been those working class defenders and Catholics who had no choice but to accept the Act of Union, but who were determined that they were going to fight back. So you had all this mix going on. And then you had Brown Square. And then you had the beginnings of the industrialisation of Belfast, and how Belfast grew. And as I explained last week, it couldn't grow north or south. It grew north and northwest. So this is the Shankill Road up here. Now, down here, so whenever Lord Donegal started selling off leases, he sold off leases just here. And I think it's Jerry, I can't remember. Who's from Hamel Street and John Street? If you can just unmute yourself for a second.
It's me, it's Jerry from John Street.
Right, okay. Well, do you know where John Street comes from?
No.
Okay, so one of those leases, because Catholics could, after the revision of the penal laws, Catholics could buy land. So it was a guy called John Hamel, who was a rich Catholic merchant. And so he built his first street, which was Hamel Street, and another street, which was here, which was Lettuce Hill. Yep. And it became John Street.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from.
Right.
And this was the pound area. Now, as I said last week, it was known as the pound because it was the cheapest, worst housing in Belfast. And my argument here is that it was also segregated in by the Farset and the Pound Burn, which is another river that runs just down here. You can just about see it. And this was a mixed area. So I don't know if you know that or not. It was a mixed area. It was around about 20% Protestant, but they were affluent Protestants because we know they were registered to here. And this is Christchurch. So just down the bottom of your screen. So to give you a wee bit of an idea where this is the Blackman Tech. Okay, this is Inst College. Behind it now is it's now their library, but then it was Christchurch. So this was the pound. Now, from the 1815 onwards, this became the scene of sectarian riots, along with the main part, which was here, because this was the traditional Catholic area of Belfast. It was outside the city walls, or the grounds as it was, because that's where Catholics weren't to live in the centre. And for some extent, Protestants weren't exactly welcomed either. Dissenters, that is, Presbyterians. So this is where they came to live. And this is the Farset. So this is the river that formed Belfast. And if you don't know, this is looking towards Castle Street. So this would be Primark, just here. So you can see that when the river flooded, it's a small stream, but when the river flooded, it would have marked a big demarcation line. And I hoped to do a PhD on this, but it's my idea that this actually was a dividing line. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second, if you bear with me, in the hope that this works. So screen share. Everybody okay so far? Yes. I'm just going to go back in. Okay, so you all see the map now? Yes. Yes, everybody says I can't see you here. Hang on.
Yes.
You see it? Yep, dead on. Okay. So I'm just going to come up, take it up. Hang on. So we're now looking at Brown Square. This is Belfast Met. This is the River Farset. This is its original courses. It ran down through Bank Square and down and into High Street. So we'll go into 3D. My computer's about to commit suicide here. Okay. And we're just doing the 360-degree around Brown Square. The yellow line is the Farset. And for anyone who is not familiar with Belfast, okay, I'm just going to stop it and we'll get around a wee bit. Just hold on a second. So I'll just hold on. Almost there. Almost there. I'll stop it there. Okay. And so this is the peace line. So that's the peace line as we know it today. It runs on up Cooper Street. So here you have the wall art, the international walls it's called. And so here you have the same separation today as what happened between 1815 and 1820, starting at Brown Square. This is where the fires were lit. This is Hamel Street and John Street here. This is Barrack Street where the barracks were.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and this is why I wanted to do this PhD, but unfortunately it wasn't the pay. Wasn't the pay. So I just want to bring this table of contents up. Okay. So I'm going to stop that bit of screen share and go back in another one now because I've learned to do that. Any questions so far? No?
Just I can remember the river going round and underneath Hastings Street Barracks. At the start of the Troubles, that they had to go and put grids in to make sure that the local unit didn't do floating bombs down past the barracks.
I didn't know that. Hold that result. I'll need to interview you on that one. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So here you have it's 1832. Come on. So this is the 1850s. So just before the 1857 preaching rats. Now I know Angelica who's a fellow student at Belfast Met is on this call. So this is a distillery at what was Brown Square, but it wouldn't have lasted any more than 2 or 3 years because the water that they were using was beginning to be completely polluted by all these mills. And I noticed, by the way, in this map, there's a fort there just beside Clonard House where the monastery's built. So there you go, isn't that ancient Irish hill fort I didn't know about? So this particular map here is 1900. So you can see how the old Brown Square, and you can see how these streets began to form. Now, here's the problem. You had people that were coming in, both Catholics and Protestants. They were trying to live, and I'll go back to this map. They were trying to find housing to work in the mills. So this is where they started to live, here and here. They would have come in, they would have tried to, first of all, find friends who they would have known. So they come in from mostly the west and north and Antrim. When they came, they had a choice. Could they assimilate? Could Protestants, they didn't have to assimilate because Belfast was, a Protestant town. But for Catholics, how could Catholics assimilate? In a study by A.C. Hepburn, who studied, can't remember, it was Italy. So there was Slovaks coming into Italy, in the Riviera. Can't remember the name. There was a city in Italy, and essentially what they did was they dropped their language, and they assimilated. They learned Italian, and so they automatically became. And within one generation, they then became some of the leading citizens in the town. For Catholics coming into Belfast, you can't drop being a Catholic. It's part of who you are. And for people coming in from the outland districts, rural districts, there was always fighting. It was always stick fighting, faction fighting, but it was stage management. Anybody who's ever been in a riot knows the stage management of riots and how it works. And that's how it worked. You got drunk, 12th of July, St. Patrick's Day, you picked a fight. Monday morning came, you went back to work, that was it. But you didn't live cheek by jowl. But when these people came to Belfast, okay, they lived cheek by jowl, and they brought some of those problems and issues with them. And this is where it all happened. Brown Square, the pound, this is where it began. And this is where the beginning of sectarian housing began as well. So this, to give you an idea, this is Smithfield Market. Okay, so this is the city hall. Okay, there's the church. And as you can see by 1800, the church also had a school, because education is a key part of what we're doing tonight. So then we come to the first riot, and here's where it happened. Now, it's in the British National Library. I can't get the actual exact source, but we think it was around 15th of August or the 13th of July. It was one of the two. My guess is that it was 13th of July. And there was an orange parade that came down, and just down here, if you know, from this is Castle Court. So there was a pub here, because by then both the Orange men and the Ribbon men met in these bars. It was the only place you could meet. There was no halls, or you couldn't hire a building if you were a Ribbon man. And so the Orange Order then marched down North Street, which is just down here, came up Wayne Tavern Street. And of course, this was traditionally a Catholic area. And this is where the riot broke out, just here. as far back as 1813, 2 years before the Battle of Waterloo. So this is the area today. By now, I'm hoping you're beginning to see some of these things and recognize them. This is Brown Street. This is Wilson Street. Okay, that's the students coming out for a fly smoke and a beer out of Belfast Met. Hoping Sheila's not listening to that one. And this is St. Stephen's Church. So this is the beginning of the Riots. The market on the old map just here. So in 1696. So you can see it's a demarcation line even then. So how did people grow apart? Well, it didn't naturally happen. So this guy here is called Henry Cook, and he's the Black Man, as he's known. It's not actually the Black Man. But if you read the memorial tablet here at the bottom of him, you can see it was erected by the Orange Order. He stands with his back to Inst, because he wanted to teach his own way. And so he became a teacher and formed one of the formers of the Presbyterian College. And most significantly, he taught people like Rowan Hannah, who we'll speak about in a moment. So radical Presbyterians. So in 1825, the House of Lords Select Committee on the State of Ireland heard a good deal of evidence about Orange disturbances, but none in relation to Belfast. Two witnesses are worth quoting: the Reverend Henry Cook, moderator of the Synod of Ulster and later principal of Presbyterian College, who gave his opinion that since Orange bonds, whom he then disliked, were merely continuing an 18th century tradition, they could not be regarded as the cause of the current dissensions between Catholic and Protestant. Right? So by contrast, this guy here, the Right Reverend Dr. Crawley, the Bishop of Down and Connor, and the former priest of Belfast, he later became the Archbishop of Armagh, gave quite an optimistic forecast. He believed that with increasing prosperity, interdenominational relations were already improving and would improve further. And I recommend this book, Belfast: An Approach to Crisis. The problem here, there was also a power struggle in the Presbyterian Church between Cook and this guy who was Montgomery. I can't remember his first name. It was William Montgomery. And the power struggle then led Cook to become even more radical. And I'm going to demonstrate that now at Brown Square, because this rivalry took place between these two men, fought over with this man at Brown Square School. So built in 1812 to 1816, you can see the kids just going in, children going in through what was then the entrance. And I'm quoting Dr. James Doyle here: I do not know of any measures which prepare the way for a better feeling in Ireland than uniting children in the same school, leading them to commune from one to another form friendships. So how did that work out? It didn't. So Brown Street School was the first Sunday school, and it was a primary school. It had 1,100 kids. If you can imagine that small building there. You had the first girls' education there as well. You had young ladies who would have came down and helped out in the local area, because Brown Square then began to become the slums. But the school also became the battleground of people who were then evangelists, such as Henry Cook, that statue that you've seen. So he joined the management committee of the school around about 1820. So the school itself used the Bible for teaching. It was part of the funding that they would have got under the Kildare schools, but they would have allowed the Catholic Bible to be used as well. When Cook stepped in, he stopped that. He believed in proselytization. So he believed that if you could just teach Catholics the error of their ways, they would then magically see the light and become Protestants. So those proselytizing ministers, now that says Henry Cook, Hugh Hannah, that's William Hannah. So Henry Cook, William Hannah, and Thomas Drew opposed the reforming and relatively moderate policies of the Reverend Henry Montgomery and Dr. Crawley. So when Catholic children were presented by the folly of fanatics of using the Catholic Douay Bible at Brown Square, they were then being actively proselytized to Protestant Bible instruction. That's not the first time it happened. I have up here the 1722, you have the Church Catechism. I think this was Achill Island or Rathlin, one of the two, where Protestants had went and produced a catechism. A catechism, for anybody who's ever been through the church, is how to be a Protestant or how to be a Catholic. And this is what was used to teach kids. You'll see the Catholic Douay Catechism of 1649. Okay. So there was segregation in religion, which we can expect. But here was a chance for to teach children some version or both versions. And that's what Dr. Crawley wanted to do. He actually volunteered and paid for all Catholic children to have a version of the Douay Bible. That was objected to by the school committee led by Henry Cook. And so the Catholic children, this was, and I've yet to be contradicted in this, the first case in Ireland where Catholic children were withdrawn from a school and segregated education began. So that happened in 1824. 1837, the institutionalization of segregated education led St. Patrick's School, who had Protestants in it, to become only 1% Protestant. And by 1852, only 3.6% of schools in the whole of Ireland had joint Catholic and Protestant school committees and boards. So although I put down it became one of the first, I'm really certain it was the first school, and I've yet to be contradicted. And it all happened at Brown Square. So this is St. Patrick's School. So if you're going up Donegal Street, it became derelict. And now it's a fantastic resource for the homeless at times, where they can go and get a hot meal of a weekend. So, and this is where those Catholic children were then sent to. So you can see that education then had split, housing had split, and height of housing split. So here you have the beginnings of the real rioting. So I'll go back. The first one will be, let's have we look, 1833. Yeah, Northern Whig. So there you go. So Patrick Griffin, Hugh Gribben, William Henry, and Thomas Kilroy indicted for an assault on Hugh Kidd on the 17th of March. So that would have been for rioting. So as you can see, so he threw a stone. Now, the point I'm making in this was stone throwing. So rioting then was a case of throwing stones. There was a normal. So here you have the 12th of July. Police were engaged on Sunday night in Sandy Row. A procession came from Draxton Mill Street at about 8:30 and entered Millfield. And I love this, but headed by a man who carried a green flag while others had green branches in their hands. And that strikes to me, that's going back to the 1798 rebellion. When they came to the house of Charles Scott, a grocer and spirit dealer at the corner of Brown Street, but he had never taken any part in politics, they attacked his house with utmost fury, broke his windows, so they were caught and bound over. Here you have the 24th of March, 1834, Magistrates Court. Thomas Sosby and two others for riot in Millfield on St. Patrick's Night had to be in prison for 7 days. So you can see the pattern beginning to form. The problem here was, unlike in the country where you could do these things, get drunk, fight the peace out, sober up, go home and go back to normal. In this packed housing, this became the battleground. The houses themselves became the battleground. And what was the big difference? Well, in this particular one here, between 2 and 3 o'clock at Mullins Corner, vicinity of Peters Hill and Millfield, considerable rioting took place, originating in party work, so Orange Order. Several persons of both sides were injured by the throwing of stones, and windows were broken. One respectable gentleman, a Catholic who resides in the neighbourhood, had just returned from public worship and was addressed in the most insulting terms by a man who bore marks of being in the affray. He demanded whiskey from him. On being refused, the ruffian swore he would be revenged of him and would wreck his house. The Catholic gentleman said he would protect himself by the best means in his power. And here's the big difference, because having registered firearms, because for the first time, the stone throwing began to take on the more sinister point. Now, something else happening in 1833, in the midst of all this, I know at the minute we're talking, just take a quick sip of water here, folks, just hold on. So 1832, The cholera epidemic happened in Belfast. There's also a minor famine just outside Belfast as well. And what you have here in Millfield, you have a guy being brought up to court for breaking lockdown. Thought this was nice. So Dr. Thompson, a member of the Board of Health, stated a case of cholera had occurred on the previous day in an entry off Millfield. And the board found it was necessary to put the entry under quarantine. So there you go. So nowadays the PSNI would fine him 60 quid. You get something very similar, okay? But you can see the panic that was taking place. And the reason being, this was Millfield. This was Brown Square. So this particular map here was drawn. Its contemporary map was done at the time. So you can see colour locations in 1832 in Brown. So very much along the areas of swampland, of poor water, okay? And then, and I want you to notice this, in 1847 when the next area came in, because here is Brown Square, okay, all the way down, and here you can see the river coming in, but also something else happened in 1847, and it was the famine. So although it says comparison with districts and they make it out to be cholera, it was actually the famine victims, which I'm going to prove in a moment. So what was it like? So over here is a contemporary drawing of the new housing, 1864 at Brown Square. So you can see it's one room kitchen. Then you had a small bedroom. Then you had a yard with a toilet. That's it. That's it. That's the housing. This is where cholera spread. It's also where the scourge also began. So it's little wonder then that some of the citizens for Brown Square, strong, cheap alcohol was an effective way of just forgetting the grinding poverties that was there. And there was a grocers, these spirit grocers then began to spring up. Pubs then were a place were becoming contentious. This is where the Orange Order or the Ribbon Men met. So in Brown Square, there was no less than 10 pubs, a whiskey distillery, 15 spirit grocers. But, you know, down here I've quoted, that's how we like, well away from public gaze. Well, a temporary anecdote to Victorian poverty, drink also had become a scourge to the working classes of the square. For example, an ancestor of the author, a certain James Higgins of Millfield, was a notorious drunkard and one of the worst characters in Belfast, according to the Reverend O'Halloran. And he also went on to say the fathers and even mothers of families spend their pittance of weekly wages in these haunts of dissipation, leaving their offspring to thrive as they may amidst hunger, nakedness and squalor. Now, earlier on, the photograph I showed you was looking up Brown Street with the Orange Arch, and I pointed out the shop. Well, there's the same shop. And there's the spirit grocer. There's the pub. And there's Brown Street School. So that was there when I was here and when I was in the army. And you can just see the British Army poking their heads around the corner. And this is what you have. The ladders are on top, or what's called the salt ladders. So that was getting over backyard walls. But I'll say no more about that one. So what about religion at Brown Square? So here you have on 1833, you have the foundation of the old church building of Townsend Street Presbyterian Church by the Marquis of Donegal. Reverend George Bellis opened this at a special ceremony, and you begin to realise then who these people are. That Dr. Hannah offered up a prayer, that's Roaring Hannah, and Henry Cook delivered the address. And on the right, you'll see the church as you'll visit whenever we're doing our tour. It's still there today, and that's the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. It was at the time that the 3 Scottish soldiers were kidnapped and murdered. But as you can see, Brown Square was their patrol area, and they're also based here. But it's a nice shot of the church just before the motorway was driven in. So today, you're going to be driving up a Westlink, you're going to be driving past this exact spot. So moving quickly on, we're nearly there. So what affected all these things, you know? Well, one of the big things for the 1840s was the repeal movement, where Catholics wanted to repeal the Act of Union. And so there was a repeal movement set up. Daniel O'Connell set up a subscription to pay for it. So I think what I want you to point out here is a vindicator from 1843, and you have a repeal in Belfast. On Monday night, an unusual meeting of the Belfast repealers was held in the rooms Bury Street. Okay, so that's just where Castle Court is. But if you have a look down here, Mr. James Hope was called to the chair after the enrolment of several associates. So even in 1843, Jimmy Hope, who had fought at the Battle of Antrim, was still active in politics. And there he was leading a Presbyterian, the repeal movement. And as he says in there, several Orange men also attended it. So how did it happen in other places? Other places like the same time in Paris, where there was poverty, revolution happened, people took to the streets. And you can see anybody who's familiar with the 1921 riots and 1933 riots, this is very familiar on the streets of Belfast. But I want you to notice now how the press portrayed that. So the Irish being on the back of the English labourers, this is Punch. And here, because we now know that the depths of the famine was occurring all around. And so the press, the Great British press, as they normally do, then tried to blame Daniel O'Connell. So rent or potatoes, rent versus potatoes. So why are they giving Daniel O'Connell some rent money for his repeal association rather than buy potatoes? But you can begin to see, do you remember the Orange Man at the start at Balnahinch? Well, now he's merged because now Catholics are the enemy. So there you see now the caricature that went all around the world of the Irish. And here we'll have modern historiography. So if you go to the Shankill graveyard today, you'll not find the famine graves, but they're there. So, you know, if you go to Friars Bush, it's now the official famine grave in Belfast with a noted 800 famine victims buried in there. But if you look down here, you'll see the watch house erected by Milligan and Sayers. You'll see the grave robbers here. And down at the very bottom, from 1847 upwards, 1,000 victims of potato famine were buried in mass graves, no names recorded. So you can spot it between these two maps. So the map of it, this is the Shankill graveyard. This is 1832, and that's the old graveyard. And you can see the watch house here in top left corner. But they had to enlarge it for the famine victims and the cholera victims. And that's why the watch house here, so here and here, and you can see the graveyard has now been expanded. And this is the area where the cholera and the famine victims were buried. And you can see this is the poor ground beside the river. It flooded. You know, the rich were buried around the outside. You can actually see their tombstones are marked. So I'm going to show you that when we go. So the Reverend Anthony McIntyre from 1853, they were in a state of absolute starvation. The mills of Brown Square have 3 pence per day to pay rent, purchase coal, and support their wife and 4 children. I would be glad if I could get their boy into a situation, an apprenticeship, the most effective modes of helping the poor. Now, there was a fuss made a few years ago about a memorial plaque, and you're going to meet this guy. This is Jack Lamb. He's the minister of Townsend Street Presbyterian Church, where for the first time ever, the famine victims, because famine has now become a political football. You'll see the genocide, Holocaust, you'll see all these terms. And so these 1,000 people, we don't know who they are. They don't have any names. And there was supposed to be a plaque here. So you can see, I took these photographs today. It's my grandson, Finn. This is the same tombstone, okay? And there's no plaque. Now I'm taking a guess, and I'm hoping that this is what they were referring to, that maybe they didn't have time to build it. I'll just scroll up here, hang on. So, no, this isn't going to work, sorry. Nope. Sorry. Back to the drawing board there. So just here in the center, it does say victim for all those of hunger and disease, but it doesn't say the word famine. And whenever we go to the graveyard, and I'm going to take you there, you're going to see why. Also want you to notice this. particular memorial here, it used to lie flat, but it has recently been renewed, re-erected. They haven't fixed it, which is a total disgrace. And this is the burial. Well, this is the memorial of a guy called John Murdoch. Now, this particular graveyard, everything you see here is false, apart from those memorials around the outside. So everything here was removed, flattened. All the Catholic gravestones were taken away and thrown in Belfast Lough. We don't know what happened to them, and only about 3 survived. So this graveyard, when you go, is a fantastic way to look at historiography in action in Belfast, bang up to today. So what happened then? So these rats then, these ministers, then began to encourage things to happen. So one of the things that they encouraged was the active proselytization. And so you had Hugh Hannah. So this is Carlisle Circus. This is the middle of Carlisle Circus. So you can see how prominent Hugh Hannah was. Okay. And he was someone who believed that you should go and preach and proselytize to Catholics, and also to try and reach those poor Protestants who were on the drink, who didn't want to go to church. They didn't perhaps have the clothes to go to church. And so they went, they brought the church to them. But what they also did was also proselytize to Catholics, which, as you can probably guess, didn't go down too well, because Catholics by then had stopped being talked down to, I think is the best way I can put it. So as Henry Cook puts it, those fears that these churchmen started to instill, whenever Hannah decided he was going to go down and preach no matter what, let them trample you in the dust, and they will trample you next below the dust. Shall we then quietly submit to have our religious liberty interfered with, even in our streets? Surely it cannot be possible that we should thus succumb, but be assured that of this one thing will allow them to stop preaching in the streets, and they will soon stop it in the churches. So this is rabble raising, and it worked. It worked. Now, Pearl Hugh, one of the first explosions of the present troubles was whenever the IRA blew him off his pedestal. That's the British Army trying to lift him. So it must have been around about, I would say, early 1970. I know where a statue is today, and I'm not telling anybody. So there you go. So what happened? Well, the 1857 preaching riots happened, and it started here. So this is Christchurch, and this is where Henry Cook preached, and he decided to hold a service on the 12th, Sunday, the 12th of July, 1857. Orange Order were banned from marching. So what they did was they put their collarettes and sashes into their pockets, and they marched up Sandy Row in column to the church, went into the church, put on their collarettes, and then he preached what essentially was the Donald Trump outside the Senate House speech. I've already referred to it in the previous slide. We can't let this happen. You know, let's take back control. All those same things that we hear today. And also involved in this was this particular guy here on the right. And this is William Johnson, and he became the minister of Townsend Street Presbyterian Church. And he was involved in what became the 1857 preaching riots. They started here at the Harbour Commissioners, worked through Customs House Square, all the way up through, and literally the whole of Belfast became, or sorry, the whole of inner Belfast became a battleground. So if I just go into this one, 12th of July, so we're up in the 1840s, it is. You know, so the Orange Anniversary passed out quietly. Members of several Orange Lodges in the Belfast district met in Christchurch on Sabbath evening, where they listened to the usual anniversary Sabbath by the Reverend Dr. Drew on leaving. So what you're beginning to see is the press giving two versions of the same story. So one version is, we're just going to church, there's no problems. The other version was, as you can see down beneath here, the police were largely reinforced in Durham Street and Sandy Row. Great crowds were collected last night in many of the adjacent streets. One or two houses in Millfield and Hamel Street were wrecked by the mob, smashing the windows with stones. And this is how the segregated housing really began. And I've just shown you here where the British Army was then deployed, or then it was the 58th Regiment of the Hussars. And this is where they made the very last charge, I think, okay, in a British city. Up, there's a place called Wilson Street, which I've already mentioned. And this is where they made the charge. And this picture here was taken in October 1969. And here you have the same building. See it there? So it's then the peace line had been erected or begun to be erected. You'll see an orange arch strung across. You'll see the women of Brown Square, and you'll see a member of the First Queens. You remember last week the guy who got his heels cut at Barrack Street, that regiment? So there he is. There they are back. But I do want to point out here that the soldier is on this side of the barricade, not the other side. Okay. And so here you have what happened in 1864. This is Brown Street National School. And this is where the Riots. So what you had was you had weapons, and you also had the balance of power in Belfast. So while the balance of power, and it was minor ratting every 12th or St. Patrick's Day, things were good. What changed that balance of power? Industrialisation changed that balance of power. The navvies from Dublin coming to work in Belfast, to cut out, to dig out the Thompson Dock and to dig out the Dargan Channel, then changed that balance of power. So on Our Lady's Day, 15th of August, 1864, they went on the drink after going to Mass down in the markets. And at Brown Square, Brown Street, Melbourne Street, numbering about 4 houses, there's scarcely a pane of glass left. Helpless women were mercilessly attacked and knocked down, and even children were beaten. The unfortunate people tried to preserve their houses as best they could, but all they could do was of extremely little effort. Brown Street School, which at the time contained about 1,200 children, was assailed with stones, bricks. Teachers and children were in a state of absolute frenzy. Poor children were hidden under the forms, and the teachers did all they could to preserve the lives of the fury of the savages, notice the terminology, by concealing them in the schoolyard and other places. You know, there was also shots fired at the school, so, you know, suppose you could argue the first school shooting happened at Brown Square too. There was one of the boys blinded, but the navvies then went on up. So this is a school as it would have been attacked that day. They went on up Brown Square, and they were going to attack Townsend Street Presbyterian Church, because remember, this guy Thompson Johnson was an active proselytizer. He was known to do that, and so the workers from the Soho foundry come out with lumps of wrought iron, and it was I call it the Battle of Townsend Street, and the navvies then went down through and into Divis Street into the pound. And that was the end of that. But how was it portrayed? Because by now you had the press taking 2 different versions of the same story. You also had 2 ballads. Most working people couldn't read, but they could sing. And so here you have the glorious Orange victory at the Belfast Riots. All you Orange men, I hope you'll draw near. Of the riots in Belfast, I'll soon let you hear how the navvies turned out and away they did go for to wreck all Brown Square and destroy Sandy Row. From a Catholic perspective, nationalist perspective, these navvies' victory, these orange monsters gathered round, as you may understand, but they would not meet our navvies nor fight them hand to hand. For when our navvies did appear, we drove them to despair and caused all the weavers to run that day and to leave Brown Square. So 2 versions of the same story. The unfortunate thing is it happened here. And this is Robert Shipboy McAdam, and this was his foundry. You can see it just here. Just behind this, there's an orange lodge forming up. You know where he's buried. I showed it last week. This is John Brown. This is Warrell Cunningham. Here you have, can't remember his name, but Shipboy's grave is down here. And Culterland is named after him because he was educated at Inst, but he was the first person to start to capture the Gaelic language. And so if you speak Gaelic today in the modern vernacular, it's thanks to this man who was a Protestant. And this is where that particular battle took place. Townsend Street Church, where you're going to be going to, Here's the River Farset. So again, this took place right here, right on this bottle line. And I found this by accident, and this is what the Peters Hill riot looked like in 1886. You can see it's evolving around a public house. The windows have been boarded up, a bit like in New York. You can see banners. You can't really make out what they are, but you can see it's very much a mob against other people. And so how were these things then transcribed, and what actually happened? So even the coroner, even inquests, couldn't get to the right way, because Belfast by then was not just physically split, religiously split, educationally split. Okay, it was even lawfully split too. The coroner reviewed the facts of the case and said it was peculiar for a jury. There was no use blinking the question, because there was perjury committed on one side or the other. In some cases, a little contradiction was always expected, even from the most truth-telling witnesses. But here, they absolutely contradicted each other positively and distinctively. One party says this man shot Halliday, and the other man says he did not. When the room was cleared, the jury remained in deliberation about 3/4 of an hour. The coroner was called in and informed there was no possibility of their agreeing. There was 11 for acquittal and 5 for guilty. The jury were discharged. Now, that particular killing was John Murdoch, who I explained about, who was killed down here in 1864. This is where his grave is, and you're going to visit it in Shankill Graveyard. Here you have Israel Mulligan, and also Friar Phillips. Do you remember him? He was assassinated. That's his probable grave there. And even by this stage, the Lord Mayor of Belfast and Lord Donegal had got into a bun fight by saying that the Marquis realised that it was starting to spin out of control, that the Belfast police were being one-sided, that the juries were being tampered with, and he then blamed the Lord Mayor of Belfast, because essentially when the rioting started, the Lord Mayor got on a train and got out of town. So what part did clergymen take part in this? Well, here you're going to visit this man's grave when we go to City Cemetery, and he was known as Richard Rutledge Kane, and he was the rector of Christ Church, that same church. But I want you to notice down here, he was erected by the Orange Men of Belfast in memory of their Grand Master, a faithful pastor and gifted orator, and a loyal Irish patriot. So I emphasize that again, a loyal Irish patriot. So over here, you'll find that Kane was also involved in organising the riots. And this happened at the Brickfields, which is roughly where Divis Towers are today. So how did that work out at Brown Square? So they built the church on the place where the riotings, and this is St. Stephen's Church in Millfield. It was built in 1869. So by then, the Church of Ireland realised that proselytization wasn't working, that it caused riots. They knew that lots of poor people couldn't afford to go to church. And because if you went to Townsend Street Church, you would have had to rent your pew, and a rent man would have came every week to take that rent. But this church was built as the first free church in Belfast. So you could go there and you could attend church, and if you wanted to put money in the collection plate, that was fair enough. No pews were reserved. And it was actually built on top of one of the very first town wells. So that I always maintain that was a holy well. I know all of this because that's my baptismal certificate over there, because that's where I was baptized, 4th of September, 1960 by the Reverend Musgrave. So that's how religion then faced this. They thought they could build their way out of it. But by then, things were starting to spin out of control. And I'm going to finish off here because I know I've run over time. Because what happened then was you then had the next big problem that was about to happen. So today we have Article 16, or we have the border down the Irish Sea. Then you had the first Home Rule question coming up. And so here you have public house arrests. So the first case was that of Mr. William Strain, who had originally been arrested for rioting, but is now charged with only having assaulted a policeman. Mr. Murphy said the accused was one of a number of men arrested in a public house from which stones had been thrown, so were thrown from the bar. There's no evidence to show the prisoner threw stones, but it was of course a proper arrest, and the prisoner's assault upon the policeman who captured him was entirely unprovoked. Okay, so that was the solicitor. So what the police said was, Constable Duffy said that on the evening in question, he was one of a body of policemen who charged the crowd at Brown Square. Many of the men ran into a public house where the prisoner was arrested by another constable. Witness assisted in taking him out of the barracks, and Strain kicked him 3 or 4 times. The man was so excited, the witness did not believe he knew he was doing. Mr. Two and the solicitor pleaded guilty and offered evidence. So he was bound over for good behaviour for 20 quid. So, because this is the beginning of the home rule question. And on the right here, we're going to carry this on next week. I'm not going to start it this week, because just like you have today, you have border and area C, all this good stuff. The same thing was being whipped up here. You have, I wanted to put this up for my colleagues here at Belfast Met, because this is where I did my walking tour. So here you have the Albert clock being pulled down because the statue of John Redmond, who's a Nationalist MP, is going to be put up there. Obviously, Protestants are going to have to migrate and get out. The Americans are involved because there's their ship. And here you have Ulster's prayer, don't let go. And you have, please, John Brown, hold on, no surrender. Okay. So, and this is before partition. So here you can see it's the 4 provinces. So how does that work out at Brown Square? So Brown Square loyalists oppose the REC border. So, and John Brown, who thought that he had died and leaving everything settled with the Act of Union, I'm afraid that wasn't to be. So that's the end of the lecture for tonight.